one isn't in Vienna that often, and in addition to thanking the Austrian Film Museum for giving me the opportunity of such a large lecture series, I wish simply to begin by dedicating this series to my friend Hermann Nietzsche and to the memory of Beate Nietzsche. I'll take the privilege of sitting. I'm much more comfortable when I sit and talk rather than I might stand up and move around, knock the table over or something of that sort, but basically I'll prefer to sit. The title of this first session is The Poetics and the Politics of Cinematic Time. And my central enterprise for these 5 days will be to attempt to promote an understanding of theory as one of the fundamental impulses of creation. There is a unexamined popular myth that somehow there is theory and then there's real practice, or a giant distinction between analytical, critical activity and creative activity. This distinction, of course, is possible, but I have never known a serious artist who was not a fierce critic, who didn't have much more adamant views about the history of his art and what constitutes important works by others in his field than any critic I've ever met. Put together 4 or 5 painters and have them start talking about what's important in painting of their own time and place, and you'll hear much more vituperative and often much more intelligent criticism than if you put the fiercest collection of painting critics together. What does this mean? It means that there is, in addition to the impulse to create art, a simultaneous and sometimes exactly coinciding impulse to define the nature of the art you are creating. In the 5 sessions here, I will be analyzing the films and the theoretical statements of a number of artists who attempted to define, through their work and through their writings and in their thought, the uniqueness of the cinematic. I will do so by attempting to reorient 5 questions, really 5 banalities, things that we hear so often that they've become meaningless, hopefully to invest them with some new and more vital sense of meaning. That is, the 5 questions that I will be dealing with in 5 days are time, then narrative, then consciousness, then myth, and then language. We've heard again and again the vile banality that film is an art of time. Of course, you feel like dying when you hear this sort of thing. But that question, film as an art in time or an art of time, simply and only opens up a much larger question of what is the nature of time and what filmmakers in particular have to tell us about the nature of time. Can we ask these theoreticians, and can we ask their films the question, what is time? So today, I want to proceed to put on the witness stand the films of Dziga Vertov and the films of Peter Kubelka, and to badger them until they tell us what is time. I've passed out I hope everyone has this text in German of Dziga Vertov's manifesto, We. If you don't, there are others here. Would you show your hands if you don't have some of these, this text? You pass some back, I think, up there. In this very early text, Vertov and his group, the Council of Three, which consisted of Vertov, his brother Mikhail Kaufman, a filmmaker and cameraman, and his wife Elizaveta Svilova, an editor. The three of them, under the collective title We, issued a manifesto about what was important in Soviet film. And the manifesto is a remarkable initial statement of Vertov's fundamental theoretical contribution, which is called the theory of intervals. Now, nobody knows what the theory of intervals means. Some cynics include Vertov in the circle of those who do not know what the theory of intervals means. But theoretical insight, theoretical productivity is not scientific productivity. A theoretician of the cinema seizes upon a metaphor, seizes upon something that he intuits as correct, and begins to probe and push forward for a definition of the uniqueness of the cinematic, rather than presenting a fully worked out system with the coherence of mathematical logic. We have to consider a text like Vir as a poem. Not a great poem, a weak poem, but nevertheless an interesting poem. Having proposed the idea of intervals, Vertov then goes on to examine what intervals mean throughout the rest of his work. So we'll be pressing towards a more precise sense of what the theory of the interval is. But as I look over this text, I want to point out a few important things. It's at the bottom of the first column and much of the second column that our attention should be directed. Two words are of crucial importance. Two words which haunt poetics in the 19th century, certainly, and 20th century poetics, appear in this emphasized passage at the bottom. The word which perhaps more theoretical ink has been spent on than anything else in late 19th century aesthetics is rhythm. The concept of rhythm, rhythmus. The other, equally fascinating and equally obscure concept is the thing, dinges. Between rhythm and the thing is somehow the essential art of film. Film will represent the inner rhythm of all things, according to Vertov. A very characteristic line in a polemical text in which two wildly ambiguous concepts are brought into play. Now, what's wildly ambiguous about the concept of a thing? We all know what a thing is. This is a thing. A book is a thing. The objective world is made up of things. Hardly. Vertov was a literate man. He was a Marxist, and he was trained in a tradition in which the concept of the thing is conceived of dialectically. That is, as the object of consciousness and as the mediating force between subjectivity and something else which will be higher. It is not a simple empirical model, then, that Vertov brings before us. By a simple empirical model, I mean that there are these highly receptive, blank, sensitive things called minds. There are these solid, real, actual entities called things, and somehow through the activity of light and sound, these actual things reflect themselves upon the sensitive mind. This model we know. This is a model which, despite the entire history of modern philosophy, represents the dominant common sense model by which we operate in the world. When Vertov talks about the thing, it is obvious, first of all, that this cannot be, because what the thing has, what makes the thing a mystery in the first place, is that it has an inner rhythm. But let's press forward without dwelling too long at this early stage on the thing. The essential material of film, he tells us, is the interval. Now here we find ourselves in a typical situation in film theory. That is, a vocabulary is being smuggled in as quickly as possible from another art in order to ground a definition of film. Here the art is music. The concept of the interval is a particularly fascinating musical concept for film. For what is an interval? An interval is a fixed relation in music, like an octave, irregardless of whatever the particular notes are that terminate or define that octave. So one has this formal entity, the octave or the fifth, or any of the classical relationships that one note must have to another. And this is true anywhere one finds them on the scale. One can transpose them and change the notes, but still the relationship that is heard of a C to a C1 higher is the octave. So Vertov is smuggling into cinema suddenly this notion that the interval is the fundamental basis for film construction. And he says, down below, and here he's being very direct and clear in the fact that he has not solved a problem, but found a metaphor and is trying to make this metaphor work. We are looking for the, well, I think we have a translation problem. It says a kinogram. Well, what sense would one get from kinogram in German? Gram. Well, what's the German word for musical staff? What? The musical scale? Well, I would suggest that the translation should be, is it Vorleicher? Kino for Leicher, rather than kinogram. It's, this comes from the sense of what they are looking for, indeed, is the scale in the musical sense for measuring the unit of cinema. If we have the intervallic relationship of one shot to another, or one image to another, on what scale can these be played? Among Vertov's other crucial notions was a simple one called film eye, kino glass. There's a film of that title, which I showed this afternoon. And Vertov thinks of the camera as a transcendental tool, that the human eye is subject to all of the limitations of human subjectivity, but that the kino eye, as a machine, is capable of transcending the limits of that subjectivity, of getting to places where the human eye can't see. I could film what's behind me, or I could film what's going on in a different room or in a different country at this time. The power of the filmic eye is clearly, in Vertov's world, a transcendental one. In 2 days, I'll be talking about a number of American avant-garde filmmakers, like Stan Brakhage in particular, who sees the camera as a very poor imitation of the human eye. In Brakhage's art, the human perception always transcends the cinematic conception, but Vertov will not have that. For Vertov, the kino eye, or cinematic representation, is a higher form of observation than any human, simple human work. And he adds to this the notion of radio eye and radio ear. That is, the very concept of the radio, which was capable of bringing things together, of making something heard in Moscow audible in Leningrad at the same time, fascinated him very much. And even in the period of silent films, he conceived of the notion of radio eye, that is, the ways in which our experience of the sound world can be represented in film. That by seeing certain things and experiencing certain rhythms, we hear, as it were, sounds, even when sounds aren't apparent. One of the things that is interesting in Vertov's theory is that there is virtually nothing in it that would distinguish cinema from television. In fact, often reading Vertov, one has the sense that television is theoretically, if not sensually, the ideal art for him, because he conceived of an art by which the Soviet society could come to know itself. Early on in his career, he worked on a film train, which is a rather fascinating system. They had a propaganda train. It would go from one town to another in the Soviet Union. You have to realize, of course, that right after the revolution, the Soviet Union was an illiterate country, that for as long as 10 years after the revolution, there were people who had never heard of Lenin. There were many people who didn't know that a revolution had taken place. There was virtually no elaborate communication within the various provinces of the Soviet Union. I don't know how long the British managed to remain there. Certainly long into the 20s, the British Army remained stationed in much of Siberia. One of the great problems that Soviet artists faced almost immediately was establishing some kind of communications, because the Soviet Revolution was really a story of two cities. It took place in Moscow and Leningrad, and then in Kiev, and once the cities were taken, it had occurred. It was not the kind of mass movement that modern communications could create. So the film train would go from town to town, and they would show films that were made in Moscow. They would set up a projector, but they would also show people what they looked like themselves. They would film in the town, develop it on the train, and cut into these films that were being made episodes of the relationship of the life of the people in that particular town to the larger entity, which was the socialist society. And Vertov conceived of the possibility of an art that would almost simultaneously be able to show the various parts of Soviet society, how it functioned in a grand economy, one part with the other. And as one reads through much of his theoretical writings, one sees that the quest for instantaneity and the quest for universality of various sources of information is very close to the theory of television. In any case, that theory of television was called by Vertov, and it's still during the period of the silent film, radio ear. Now, Vertov tells us very little explicitly about his concept of time. One has to push a little deeper. In a isolated paragraph from one of his later essays from Kino Glass, from Kino Eye to Radio Eye it's called, there is a short passage of time, about time, and I put it at the bottom of this page. It says that Kino Glass is the overcoming of time. Now, one of Vertov's major concerns was the triumph of the camera over all of the limitations of bourgeois common sense. And if there is one form of bourgeois common sense, or of simple traditional common sense that dominates modern thought, is the linearity of time. Yesterday was the past, right now is the present, tomorrow is the future. This linear model of time is an exceptionally seductive and persuasive one, despite the tremendous attack philosophy has continually made on it. Vertov held a political view of time, a Marxist view of time. He held it so radically that he delighted, in fact, in attacking filmmakers like Eisenstein, whom he thought had fundamentally repudiated Marxist principles by making a reactionary film like Potemkin or October. Why reactionary? Because when you take a ship and you call it the Potemkin, and you dress up a group of 1925 sailors to look like sailors in 1905, or when you take a series of scenes in the Winter Palace and you make believe it's 1916 rather than 1926, you are committing, as far as Vertov was concerned, a fundamental trick, a lie, towards your viewers a denial of the Marxist view, or of a truly what he would call productive view of time. You're using films to monumentalize something which is past and which is inaccessible to the camera except through the models of dramatic representation or representation. The debate between Eisenstein and Vertov is very interesting. Eisenstein fires back with an attack on Vertov, claiming that he's nothing but an empty experimenter and a banal impressionist. The debate is quite a fascinating one. But for Vertov's view of what we would call the temporal ecstasies, what in common parlance, past, present, and future, are not linear at all. That is, what we know of pastness and what we know of futurity and what we know of present are purely political as far as Vertov is concerned. That if he wants to film the past, he says, he can go down any street in Moscow and find a church, and find a group of drunks, and find all of the vestiges of class society that he is not that he believes socialism wants to overcome. That they are fully present at all points in society, that it is a naive notion to relegate pastness to some sheerly historical period and to say, look back at the days when such and such was the case. That is, continually before the eye of the camera or before the eye of the consciousness of the filmmaker is the possibility of seeing the past, filming it directly. Likewise, the future. That there are elements within society which constitute the future, and there are elements in society which constitute the past, and what is called the present is the mode of production by which, one, the reactionary elements are transformed into, two, the progressive elements. It's a radical and exceptionally fascinating view. It is demonstrated at the beginning of the film Enthusiasm. I'll show you that passage now, not from the very beginning, but from close to the beginning of Vertov's first sound film, Enthusiasm, where a direct comparison between alcoholism and religion is established, and monarchy, czararchy, and its possible transformation into socially organized forms of communal activity and entertainment. That is, to turn the church into a club, to take the drunks off the street and make them part of this recreation center. Let's see the passage from Enthusiasm. Here, the principle was developed at length. That is, if there is an inner rhythm of things, then that inner rhythm is what Vertov observed when he compared the very gestures of the men and women making the sign of the cross and bowing down to kiss the bottoms of the icons with similar gestures on the part of drunks waking up in public parks and pouring down their vodka bottles or brushing away the camera. That is, somehow there was a fundamental inner unity between these elements of pastness in society which get broken down through the work or the rhythm. And here in Vertov's first sound film, one hears continually the rhythm of progress, the buoyant music of socialist transformation, until the church is turned into a club. And it's very important also that Vertov uses, to demonstrate this transformation, a number of modes of representation which are purely and only and uniquely cinematic. That is, the way in which we see the club sign arising is through reversed motion of the camera, which is a mode of seeing that no human being ever had in the history of the world until Promio, in 1897, I believe, filmed the Baths of Diana in Rome. And when he showed it, he cranked the camera backwards, and out of the water came divers leaping up and onto the board. This is uniquely cinematic. Vertov is using this uniqueness of the cinematic at this particular point to emphasize the way in which film is helping make visible for us the true nature of time in Soviet society. And all through this first part of the film, radio ear is very important, because the woman who is a radio operator is hearing the symphony of the entire Don Basin that is coming from numerous different sources. Via radio, these sound impulses come to her, and she, as the mediator or vehicle of the film, then is that center around which all of these various sound elements can be heard. Are we ready with the other? With the next excerpt? I don't know. I was supposed to get a signal on that. Hold on. I won't go right this second. I just want to know if I'm ready. Okay, but I just have to know if he's ready at each particular point. Thank you. We'll go to a similar montage in one of Vertov's silent films. This is Forward Soviet, or Shagai Soviet. And the situation describes what it is like today in the Soviet Union through the miracle of electricity. Electrification is one of the central themes in Vertov. It is not by accident at all that at the moment of transformation in enthusiasm, at the juncture between the first images of the church, the crown, and the drunks, to its political transformation, is a shot of a factory whistle, but framed through the lines of electrical wires. Electricity is the central metaphor in Vertov's films for the transformational power of cinema and of society. And they're linked together, of course, as I will show in Men with a Movie Camera. They're linked together because electricity is essential for the representation, for the showing of a film. It's an important part of the very cinematic mode of operation. And in several of Vertov's theoretical texts, he refers to the man represented in film, the socialist man, someone who is not a simple human actor, as you would find on a stage, but a person who could have the most handsome face and the fastest legs and leap the highest simply by cutting from one individual to another individual to another individual in cinematic montage, creates what he calls at one point the new Adam, but more often the electrical young man. The electrical young man is the generalized or the transcendent young Soviet worker. But if we go back to Forward Soviet, we'll see what makes Soviet society move forward, that is electricity. And the various structures of time, that is the transformation of pastness into future, is demonstrated in a series of titles which say, today we have, and it shows what we have, and then it says, it isn't as it was in the immediate past when we had, then you'll see what is in the immediate past. Soviet society is overcoming the following things, and you'll see the horrors that Soviet society is overcoming. But all of these horrors are present to the filmmaker who wants to film them. It isn't as though they are something in the dim, distant past that Soviet society can congratulate itself about and forget about. The nature of time, as far as Vertov is concerned, has nothing at all to do with that kind of historical chronological grid, that you don't have to worry about Ivan the Terrible anymore. This to him is a banal and useless and non-productive form of time. But let's see this portion of Shagai Soviet. So one sees there, in programmatic terms again, what there is in contemporary Soviet society: electricity, running water, heat, and how these things did not exist in that area called the past. But the way in which Vertov does that brings us even closer to, brings us a little closer to a theory of the intervals. Because sometimes he has at his disposal images of starvation, of people dead, of primitive means of processing food, of carrying water through the streets. And it's perfectly evident that someone is carrying water through the streets of the society that was contemporary to him. And at the same time, he uses a number of devices that are purely formal. That is, there was no electricity, and the electric light goes out. Or in the representation of typhus, he simply shows a bug and then a microscopic image of the typhus development, typhus growth. That a light in and of itself, an electric light going on, in and of itself is nothing. It is a null image. It is void. It has no meaning. An electric light going out has no meaning. A little bug held in the fingers has no meaning in itself. Even the horrifying image of those dead, starved children has no real meaning for Vertov in itself. It is only when put together in a particular order, so that the relationship of one to the other is articulated, that meaning manifests itself. In other words, it is in the intervals, in the spaces between these different images, whereby their relationship comes about, comes on to take meaning. One should also note that it's quite deliberate on Vertov's part that he shows you first electricity, running water, heat, and afterwards the so-called images of the past. Vertov does not want to fall into the trap of presenting a new model of time and then organizing his film as if it should be a sheer succession, the first images being of the earliest period of time all the way up to the latest images. Not at all. That the images are set up as purely mediatory or empty, void signs, which can recur and give new meaning in a different context. So an electric light going on has one meaning in a particular montage context, and that same electric light going off has an antithetical meaning in a different montage context. I mean, very simply, with the scene of the running water, we see the sink turned on and the water flows. And then we see what is obviously the very same sink, and the water doesn't flow. It is not that that image of the sink where the water doesn't flow is chronologically older of necessity than the image in which the water flows, but that the very concept of pastness and of futurity are imbued in the relationship these images have one to the other. In his film The 11th Year, which describes the industrialization of part of the, I think, the Ukraine, there is a passage where the building of a factory, which is seen in terms of sheer progress, also is progress towards the recovery of the past. And there's an early montage sequence in which the construction of the factory leads to the archaeological discovery of the body of a Scythian who had once lived in that part of Ukraine. So that, on the one hand, that land seen before the coming of the factory neither knew its history nor did it know its future. Through the productive activity of building the factory, both the history and the future are simultaneously brought forward. The most important demonstration of the theory of intervals occurs in Vertov's masterpiece, The Man with a Movie Camera. In this film, the politics of temporality are played down. This is an ecstatic poem rather than a political polemic. And here we have the description of almost a complete day. That is, it is a film which describes a Soviet society from the point of waking in the morning up until the evening. But not exactly. It doesn't include the night. It begins in a movie theater, and it ends in a movie theater. So what it really shows is Soviet society coming to the movies, coming to the cinema, in order to see, in a condensed and organized form, through the use of intervallic montage, its image of itself during the day. At night, electricity is used to illuminate that which was not illuminated when the sun was out. So what one has is the day as a fiction within a film that is about the very experience that anyone going to the film would have. In other words, Vertov is doing everything possible to give you the sense of identifying with the temporal experience of the viewers whom he shows in his movie. His film begins with the arrival of the projectionist at the theater, so it begins a little before your normal experience of the film, and the film that he projects is indeed the film that you see. And at certain crucial points in it, one sees how the audience is watching it, and one also sees all the way through how the film was produced. That's probably the most essential element. Here we see filmmaking as an essential activity in Soviet society, not as entertainment, but as the vehicle by which the society can come to know itself as an organism greater than any single individual consciousness. It is cinema as a tool for the transcending of the limitations of individual psychology and the individual limitations in time and place. I have several excerpts, all much briefer than what I've shown you before, from this film. I'll see the first. Now, since I'm using several excerpts on the same reel, can I get a signal as to when the next excerpt will be ready? Just give me some kind of a sign as to when it will, because there'll be some moments in between while he's winding. What will happen? He'll ring. Okay, fine. So here in the beginning, we see the audience arriving in the theater. It is, of course, the identity to the experience the viewer should just have had. He has just arrived in the movie theater, and he sees the way in which the theater was prepared for his entry. One very important element here is that the time not be literal. Vertov is not concerned with making a film that would be like a mirror, that would attempt to seduce you into thinking that the time on the screen is the exact equivalent of the time you are, that it is the exact equivalent of the time you were experiencing or taking to watch the film. Several modern avant-garde filmmakers have done such things, experiments in literal time. That's not Vertov's concern at all. So he deliberately cuts back to the empty seats several times, and the excerpt could have gone on much longer, several times to show you the relationship of the preparation of the theater to its gradual filling up. But each time that he cuts to a 10-second image of the seats coming down, obviously 5-10 minutes have occurred as the audience grows larger and larger in coming into this theater. Now, one of the reasons I take this to happen is that Vertov wants to create a distinction between one dominant rhythmic way of conceiving of fundamental rhythms, traditional rhythms, by which temporal events are measured. Obviously, Vertov is saying we can't do away with time in that simple sense. We can't completely reorient the temporal human experience into one that continually politicizes time, that continually sees the phenomena of the world, these things, as having immanent interior rhythms that can be developed by certain kinds of selection so that we know the meaning of progress in society. Yet, we can contain and present and develop and expose the diurnal rhythm, the daily rhythm, and show how consciousness makes the day. That is, the human being doesn't experience the day, receive it, store it, and develop it, but through certain deliberate acts of choosing among perceptions. That is, by participating in a selection of intervals along a scale, we create the very things by which we know the forms of the day. Now, at this point, it would be useful if I had the excerpt, but I presume it isn't ready. This in certain of these instances, is it? In certain of the instances in the next few days, it'll be particularly complicated when one chooses a series of excerpts all from within the same reel. Do you know if he's ready? Okay. In the scene we're about to see, Virchow creates a constructivist form of a dream. Virchow is not at all concerned with Freudian psychology, with the dream work as a source of inspiration for his art. In fact, he deeply repudiated and polemically repudiated any notion of the unconscious as a formative element in art. For Virchow, consciousness was the entire issue of art, and that consciousness always meant one thing, that is self-consciousness. There is the apprehension by the mind of an object, and then the realization that the mind constitutes that object through the way in which it apprehends it. So that in that process, as in any elementary version of a dialectic that was formulated at least as early as Hegel, in any elementary version of that process, quickly the object as such disappears. The raw, brute material of the instant disappears and becomes involved in a much more complicated and elaborate dialectic of perception and recognition. We have, first of all, he would say, in a world, an utter chaos of optical and sound experiences. And many filmmakers will want to dwell with this chaos. But that out of that initial chaos, we quickly determine that some of those chaotic phenomena are things. So that, for instance, the same example is given by both Nietzsche and Rousseau. Nietzsche says that as soon as I look out and I see not a unique visual field, but I see a tree, the moment that I see a tree and that I recognize that this particular phenomena with branches and leaves is like, but not exactly like, another phenomena with branches and trees, and that I can generalize, I can say that they are all part of the same class, and that even further I can name that class as tree, then I've suddenly stopped perceiving trees at all. I've stopped being concerned with the immediate visual field, but I've come to perceive trees, something which I myself invented out of my generalization of certain patterning activities in my own mind, or in one's collective mind. Likewise, Virchow is concerned with that quick move into self-reflection by which the mind recognizes its own selecting activities and the way in which it operates. Here we'll see in the dream sequence how that works. There's a brief moment you saw where the optical adventure, as such, momentarily constituted itself as a brief moment of error. That is, the camera apprehends a field of vision, which it quickly resolves into a series of blossoms, flowers. To return to what I was saying when the excerpt was prepared, Vertov is not concerned with the elementary evolution of perception, that is, the movement from sheer sensual sensibility to perception, from that point at which the eyes and ears, or let us say the eyes in the silent film, encounter a visual field to the resolution of that visual field into a series of named objects. And then the second mode of perception, the way in which that present, here and now visual world of named objects can be compared in the mind to absent named objects, and therefore give us a wider sense of the particular nature of what we are seeing at any given time. Many filmmakers will dwell upon this particular evolution or dialectic of immediate sensual consciousness. Vertov isn't concerned about that at all. He will acknowledge it, but always in a comic mode, as here in the metaphor of the blinking eyes and the flickering montage and the window slats. That the point at which human perception becomes the guiding model for camera perception is for Vertov almost comic. It's a low point. That the camera begins at a point where what we know of human perception can take a further dimension. We can see the way in which our knowledge is created and the way in which our knowledge and our kinds of knowledge have relationships to other parts. Now, let us consider this dream episode, if it is such. The sequence is describing the morning. The nature of the montage would be described rhetorically as metonymic. That is, metonymy is the placing side by side of a series of elements in one continual descriptive form. So here we see various streets in the morning, birds in the morning, a lone car with a cameraman moving through the streets in the morning. That is, we, seeing one image after the other, are forced to determine what the nature of the relationship is. And one of the first things we determine is that, it is simultaneous, it is morning. This is a generalized description of a time of the day. By metonymically building up these shots one after the other, we are reinforcing the invisible notion of a particular time of day. Now, the incredible wit and brilliance of men with a movie camera is to continually establish patterns by which we think the fundamental relationship of shot to shot or interval to interval is quite clear, and then suddenly tangentially twist them and move in a different direction. So here we see two things simultaneously. A person sleeping. In fact, the non-significance of the individuality of this person sleeping is emphasized by the fact that all we see is her arm and part of her head. We don't even see the whole person. A person is sleeping, the birds are settling on the roofs, yet the cameraman is off to his morning duties. And he's filming a train. But suddenly, by a certain kind of selection of details, that is a foot over the rail, the speed at which it's filmed, we are led to react to uncreated horror. In other words, Vertov is showing us how, in conventional movies, quickening of the montage and the use of certain selected details creates the illusion, the fiction, of a disaster. And right after that, he cuts to the woman waking up. So that we see an association between the dream mechanism and dream seen not as Freudian revelation of interior processes, but as jumbled and misconceived intervallic relationships in the world. Dream as error is precisely the model of the commercial dramatic cinema. Vertov gives us a demonstration of how to put together a horror sequence in a film by tricks, and shows us the way in which we view this. We quickly get induced into accepting this mode of representation is precisely the way in which a dream occurs. And after that, Vertov then shows us how the shot was really produced. In other words, that the meaning of the shot isn't what dramatic value we determine from it, but its meaning is the relationship of its mode of production to its effect. Its mode of production was by digging a hole underneath the tracks and having the cameraman lie under there. We see the hole, we see him get up from it, and off he goes. Then, immediately afterwards, the mode of metonymy, that is, things being next to each other because they occur in the same place or the same time, presumably, switches to the mode of metaphor. One thing follows another because of some act of similarity. So we see the woman beginning to wash, and we see the streets of the city being washed. We see the woman focusing her eyes, and we see the camera lens focusing. We see the woman blink, and we see how the camera lens can imitate that particular mode of blinking. In other words, we have seen in one very brief passage the movement between metaphor and metonymy from a rhetoric by which one shot next to each other represents a unity of time, to one in which a unity of activity or a comparison of activity occurs. And yet, by using the very same shots and the very same people, Vertov is emphasizing that it isn't the shot which makes the metaphor, it isn't the shot which makes the metonymy, it's the intervallic relationship of the two. The way in which they lie next to each other in the film constitutes not just their meaning, but the very mode in which we observe them and respond to them. That is, what we are responding is not, what we're responding to is not the images, but to the intervallic relationships between them. Let's see another example. Here the rhetorical system is slightly different. At first we are involved in another metonymic form of representation. What's happening? What is the internal rhythm of the thing? Well, the thing seems to be a carriage is going through the streets of the city driven by a horse, and a cameraman is filming it. So we see the people in the carriage moving along, and metonymically cut to the horse moving along. We assume that the carriage is right behind the horse. And then we cut to the filmmaker filming the scene. He's right beside the carriage. And so we are going along in a series of shots, the relationship of one to the other, as they are all contiguous parts of one event. And then suddenly something happens. A new relationship is established within the very same image content. We have the moving horse, and we have the still image of the horse. In other words, here Vertov is demonstrating very emphatically that it isn't the content of the image, but the intervallic relationship that makes the difference of meaning. The horse is still, followed by images of the people in the carriage, still, by people on the streets of Moscow, still, by an old woman, still, by a strip of film in which we see successive images of a child laughing, until we end up with the image of all of the rolls of the film in one of the editing tables. So what has happened is the thematic unity has ceased to be the carriage ride and has come to be the very nature of the filmic materials out of which this carriage ride is created. So Vertov is able to introduce at this point two very interesting images which we hadn't seen at all in the film before. Those are images of little girls laughing or emoting in some way. It's the first time they occur in the film. They have nothing to do with the metonymic or contextual situation. Why they are there is quite obviously because they are other examples of still cinematic images. They are part of the theme of stillness. Now, here the trope or the rhetorical figure is clearly irony. He has taken a moving image and ironized it, shifted its meaning, turned it from figurative, that is, from representing motion, to literal, to being a film-covered surface or a strip of film. So that play between the figurative and the literal is always an ironic figure. He has ironized this particular scene in order to show still another dimension of the mode of productivity of what we take to be a cinematic illusion, of what we take as a film, this illusion of the city. I will show another brief excerpt and then show you the context, another context for which those frozen images of the children occur, so that we will see those very same images, once again, in a new intervallic relationship, which should not only make us aware of the flexibility of filmic material, but in this particular film is meant to make us aware of the kind of activity, of the kind of work we as viewers have to do in order to produce the film. In other words, the intervals simply lay the images one next to each other, and as cognizant viewers, we are involved in producing meaning, in generating meaning by responding cognitively to the intervallic system. In this part of the film, another mode of rhythm is being explored. We have the marriage contracts, the divorce certificates, death, wedding, birth. Does that mean he's ready on this? Yeah. Okay. So that another rhythm which we tend to see in the long range, that is, in a dramatic film or in a novel, there is a known order. There is birth, marriage certificate, wedding, birth, divorce, death, in some proximate, some such order. What Vertov is emphasizing here, through the power of the camera, is the sheer simultaneity of these events. That is, these are the major basic rites of passage, so that the wedding and the birth and the marriage and the divorce are all part of that same one immanent rhythm. Or what the thing is the human response to a temporal expanse of life, to living out a particular time. But Vertov is ideologically denying the authority of a linear model for these various modes of activity. That death is not cumulative. It isn't the culminating instance. In fact, that title in Shagai Soviet, the last title of the excerpt we saw was, "And Soviet society is overcoming death." This transcendence of death, which one finds and alluded to in Vertov cinema, becomes a fundamental theme in Dovzhenko's cinema, and in the fourth of these long sessions, if any of you are still left by then, we will be going through the relationship to death in Dovzhenko's work. But now I'll show you the context from which those images, those frozen images of the strips of the children came. This is a great example of the invitation, the engraved invitation to be suckers. Because we know that these are nothing but film strips. We've seen that already. We know that the reaction formation of the children is produced by the editor. We saw them hanging in her editing room. We see an image of the magician and then a reaction, an image of the magician and a reaction. Yet we have the tendency to produce a metonymic continuity or even a cause and effect relationship between these disparate images. In other words, we as film viewers are as naive in taking in this trick as those children are in taking in the magician's tricks. That this is one of the fundamental tricks of cinematic illusion, the interval called cause and effect. to show someone looking and reacting, and to show supposedly what they're showing, back and forth, back and forth. This is as much a part of the old bag of tricks of the movies as these elementary illusions of the Chinese or Oriental magician is. By the way, those of you who saw Kino Glass will know that this is a favorite image of Vertov's, that the magician appears in Kino Glass, but in a different editing context, that there is no essential relationship between these laughing children and that particular magician. That the comparison of those two films, which you were able to see at length this afternoon, would make that particularly clear. We come closer to the answer of the question then of why the metaphor of the interval. I suggest that the mystery of what Vertov means by intervals, I've been suggesting it implicitly and now I'll suggest it explicitly, can be illuminated, if not solved, by the substitution of another metaphor. That is, where Vertov talks of intervals, I've been talking of rhetorical tropes. That we have in the descriptive language of literature a vocabulary of ironies, metaphors, metonymies, solipses, prolepses. You all had to memorize these things when studying Latin to analyze Virgil. It is a vocabulary, a highly sophisticated vocabulary of the formal kinds of relationships that comparisons or analogies or antitheses can have to one another. That is, a metaphor does not depend upon anything, any particular thing being compared to something else. You can compare a flower to a bird. You can compare a person to a horse. The particular content of the metaphor is independent of the concept of metaphor itself. Likewise of metonymy, likewise of irony. So that what Vertov was seeking in the notion of the intervals was a general theory of the rhetoric of film. A theory of the rhetoric of film in which the individual nature of any given shot would not be at stake, but what would be fundamentally at stake would be this kinds of relation. Now, what advantage does the vocabulary of intervals have for a description of this sort which rhetoric does not have? I can think of one, and that is that rhetorical analysis primarily depends upon contiguity. That is, one talks about the relationship of one word to the word that's next to it, or one phrase to the phrase that's next to it, or even one sentence to the sentence that's next to it. Primarily a phrase-to-phrase contiguity. That is, there is no rhetorical vocabulary to describe the relationship of a phrase on page 10 to a phrase on page 25. Yet the musical metaphor of the interval is one which brings all of the elements into a simultaneous prehension. That not only is there harmonic interval, not only when you hear a C and a D at one particular time is there an intervallic relationship, but one can say that within melody there's an intervallic relationship. That is, between one note and a note 6 notes away or a note 20 notes away, there is a fixed intervallic relationship. That the metaphor of music describes more than any other critical vocabulary the way in which whole series of elements are prehended one to the other. And Vertov is obviously and quite deliberately trying to make us prehend simultaneously all of the elements of his film, The Man with a Movie Camera. The literal time is the time of looking at the film, the time we spend in the theater. But that all of these elements recur in so many different ways, are repeated and varied in so many ways, that new intervallic relationships are established throughout these various termini. I will show you one last excerpt from Man with a Movie Camera, conclude my observations on Vertov, and briefly attempt to draw an analogy and some distinctions with Kubelka's films and theories. I had one more excerpt, but it will not be necessary. He should thread up Adibar and Schweckater. Okay. So we have in Vertov, then, a filmmaker deeply committed to a political and productive view of time. A filmmaker who conceives of past, present, and future as having primarily political meaning, and conceives of the way in which that the most important aspect of socialism for Vertov, and the fundamental one, is that it is a way of organizing the perception of the world. And his film Man with a Movie Camera is about the way in which we organize our perception of the world, the way in which we prehend things that are apart as together. The concept of radio ear and radio eye, and we saw radio eye illustrated here in the sound montage, which gives us the sense of sound through familiarly sounding objects by means of their looks and the rhythm of the montage. We have imbued in us a sense of sound. But radio ear is that principle by which things which are very far apart can come into rhythmic association, that can exchange their meanings. People who are very far apart can exchange their meanings. That within the actual field of the film, within the montage structure of the film, things which are far apart come to be next to one another. And we see the radio, and we see the sounds, and we see numerous people in many different places responding ecstatically to music. Women laughing, men smiling, but we see them so that obviously they are not right in front of the music that is being made. That montage has brought them together across space, but only brought them together for us as viewers to produce meaning from them. That is, the fundamental responsibility of a socialist citizen, as far as Vertov was concerned, was to produce socialist meaning out of the world, to organize his perceptions responsibly. The fundamental achievement of a filmmaker was to show socialist society how it produced its meaning. Now, if we turn away from Vertov with his late Hegelian and Marxist conception of time and of the organization of the collective spirit, to the very different theoretical impulse of Peter Kubelka and his films, I'll very briefly allude to a series of theoretical positions Kubelka has taken for two reasons. One, his lecture series has just concluded here a few days ago, and I assume that you're as familiar with it as any summary I might give. Two, there is no text. And Vertov wrote a lot. Kubelka produces an oral theory, so that therefore one cannot pin it down to a particular textual connection, but to a series of themes and metaphors which recur. And I've noted 5 such areas of recurrence as significant in a comparison and distinction from Vertov. On the one hand, in Kubelka's discourse, he tends to speak of the Stone Age, our age and all periods as the Stone Age. Stone Age man in Unsere Afrika-Reise is no different than the tourists and hunters who went to shoot animals in Unsere Afrika-Reise. It is a unified view of the human race at its most primitive. And throughout Kubelka's discourse, the discussion of the Stone Age as the only age, as the human age, is regular. Now, on a formal level, there is the emphasis on articulation, and that articulation being between frames. In other words, a distinction against Eisenstein's theory of collision, where he says shot A collides with shot B, and together they produce a synthetic event. Kubelka continually says that frame A comes up against frame B, and when it's a conventional movie, it weakly articulates, say, legs gradually walking across the screen. At its most radical, it can be a total reversal, that is, from black to white, from silence to a blast of sound. One also hears in Kubelka's discourse an emphasis on speed. That is, story after story is told of how film lacks the sensual immediacy of ritual, of theater, the richness of painting. What it has instead is a speed of 24 frames a second. Then the claim that the best way to view such films is by memorizing them, to see them over and over and over again until one has them at hand. And finally, and this is the most curious and interesting of all, there is a tendency to bestow, through metaphor, an objective status on the films. That is, to raise them to the status of natural objects. Comparisons tend to be solidified in the various lectures and tapes I've heard. That is, Adibar is compared to a moving stream, Schweketer to a fire, Arnulf Reiner to the phenomenon of thunder and lightning. That is, in these films, which are so removed from the natural universe, these three films in which one does not see a thing of the conventional romantic nature imagery, are yet compared structurally to the status of these natural phenomena. Not just any natural phenomena, but the classic objects of contemplation, of, in the case of the stream and of fire, the classic observations of the prehension of form within a field of constant change. It is towards Adibar and Schweketer at this particular point that I want to focus my attention. By means of a text written in 1915 and published in 1916, certainly not by Kubelka, but by a psychologist named Hugo Münsterberg, who had moved from Germany to America, was teaching at Harvard, and as early as 1915 decided that he would write a book on the way in which movies work. It's called the photoplay. And many of the things he perceived as possible in film weren't exactly done. Discussing the relationship of cinema to emotion, Münsterberg says the following: as soon as we give any interest to this formal aspect of presentation, we must recognize that the photo playwright has here possibilities to which nothing corresponds in the world of the stage. Take the case that we want to produce an effect of trembling. We might use the pictures as the camera has taken them, 16 in a second. But in reproducing them on the screen, we change their order. After giving the first 4 pictures, we go back to picture 3. Then give 4, 5, 6, and return to 5. Then 6, 7, 8, then go back to 7, and so on. Any other rhythm, of course, is equally possible. The effect is one which never occurs in nature and which could not be produced on the stage. The events for a moment go backwards. A certain vibration goes through the world like the tremulo of the orchestra, or we demand from our camera a still more complex service. Okay. Surprisingly, no filmmaker, as far as I know, before Schweketer, was involved in the micro-reorganization of the same image on a frame-by-frame basis. Münsterberg, of course, is conceiving it in purely representational terms. How do we get a good trembling shot? How do we really show someone shaking? Well, we can reorganize the frames. What Münsterberg didn't know was how difficult or painstaking this was practically, and how uninterested the conventional filmmakers of 1915 were in such meticulous effects. In Kubelka's case, it is not a matter of the representation of trembling, but one feels very close to Münsterberg when he says, the effect is one which never occurs in nature and which could not be produced on the stage. Quite the opposite is Kubelka's claim that although the image is not one which occurs in nature, the structural elements are mimetic of the fundamental processes of high romantic nature art. That is, the contemplation of continuity in change in the status of stream, fire, and lightning. I'm going to show Adebar and Schweikhater. I'll show them one right after the other, and then make my concluding remarks. Adebar, of course, there is neither beginning nor end nor sequence. Termination is that simple moment when the image freezes, but it freezes at the end of each dance movement. There's no way in which we can construct a narrative and say first they moved this way, then they moved like that. No. These are events. All of the dance movements exist in an area of simultaneity, and that simultaneity is reinforced by the obsessive repetition of the images in its fundamental structure. The case is even more radical for Schweikhater, because if one thinks about it, one could create quite a banal sequence. That is, they sit down in the restaurant and they decide to order Schweikhater, and the Ober comes and he pours some Schweikhater, which bubbles into the thing, and they drink it. That is, in other words, inscribed within the film is somehow, perversely, the possibility of that sequence, but everything in the film is committed to the denial of that sequence. That is, the pouring, the drinking, the bubbling of the beer are all simultaneous. In fact, the nature of the montage and of the coloring and of the negative is to obliterate as much as possible the very nature of those events themselves anyway, to take the beerness out of the beer, just as the space is removed in Adebar. So what we have in both films are examples within the limitation of successiveness of cinema, that cinema is successive, that one fact you're stuck with is that the first frame you're going to see is the first one on the reel of the film. I mean, there's a strip of film. That is a fact in an act of film. But within that successiveness, these two films of Kubelka represent and bespeak a simultaneous order, an event in which all the elements of the event, be it dance or drinking, occur simultaneously. Likewise, even in Mosaic in Vertrauen or in Unsere Afrika Reise, it is very difficult, although there are hints, of ever being able to assign priority of one shot to another. The sequence of the shots is a constructed one, a sequence that only exists within the order of the film. They do not refer to some exterior temporal order in that sense. Now, these two films, Adebar and Schweikhater, according to the theoretical claims, which I've previously given an example of, are immanent structures for which the natural world is a metaphor. It isn't as if one sits in front of a stream and says, how can I best represent the stream? No. The nature of Kubelka's theoretical formation is that somehow the world conventionally and naturalistically manifests a number of fundamentally immanent rhythms. That there is this structure, of which Adebar is an example, and another example of that same structure, not in film, but in God's workshop, is the stream. There is this structure which is Schweikhater, and another of these, and that in a grosser medium called actuality, it's fire. There is no priority given, and the very nature of the metaphorical priority of the natural over the interiorized. Now, I take this to be totally in accord, this emphasis on immanent structure, to be totally in accord with the denial of the authority of sequential causality that the films demonstrate. And furthermore, I take it to be in accord with the very concept of memorization. What is it to memorize a film? what is the experience of memorizing? Memorizing is the obliteration of an initial experience, but of a re-experiencing of that which is known. And the great passage on memorization and time is not Kubelka's, but Augustine's. And it occurs in the fantastic 11th book of the Confessions, when Augustine asks himself, what is time? And he says, I always know what time is when the question isn't asked. But once you ask the question, I don't know what time is. There's one passage in which he describes the act of memorization. I have it in Latin and German. I don't have the courage to even try to read the German aloud. My German accent is so terrible. I'll translate from the Latin into English. He says, Dictura sum canticum. I am about to recite one of the Psalms, quod novi, which I know by heart. Before I begin, everything is in the state of expectation. The whole thing is in the state of expectation. When I begin, some of that expectation gets turned into the past. It becomes part of the memory. So therefore, the whole life of my action is turned into memory as I say the poem, although I am still anticipating some of the things which I will continue to say. As I go on, my expectation gets shorter and my memory gets longer, until suddenly the whole expectation is consumed and translated into the memory. In other words, that as I recite a familiar poem or prayer, and here he's giving an example of a prayer, I know all the words. I mean, I know the Pater Noster, say, by heart. What does it mean to know it by heart? Part of expectation. Yet this is the essential nature of the human model by which we experience time. That is, there is no single razor-sharp sense of the present, but the prehension of one whole, something which is memorized, quod novi. And he said, at quod in toto cantico, and what is true for the whole of the psalm is true for all of its particulars, even down to the singular syllables. And what is true for a small psalm is also true for the whole life of a man, all of its parts and all of the actions of a man. And what is true for the life of a single man is true in toto saeculo filiorum hominium, for the whole generation of the sons of man, which are the parts of human life. That is, as Augustine says, memorization is that way in which we prehend time as a whole, in which we interiorize this process called time. That in this act of reciting that which we have memorized, or seeing a film that we have memorized, we are re-experiencing the whole of the film in a series of successive moments. But at every one of those moments, the whole of the film, or the whole of the prayer, or the whole of the psalm is present to us. Likewise, as Augustine would say, that from the perspective of God, sub specie aeternitatis, the whole of human history is present. It is only from our limited human historical perspective that we have to take it an inch at a time. And likewise, Kubelka's Augustinian cinema, an Augustinian view of the cinema. That is, the film is prehended as a solid whole, which has to be experienced in time. It is tied to a poetic and political view of the world as part of a non-progressive view of the world, one in which the Stone Age constitutes the metaphor for the simultaneity of human activity under that view. So that in the case of Vertov and in the case of Kubelka, I think we can begin to outline that the impulse to make theory and the impulse to make film are tied through the theory of time, to the concept of time, to a simultaneous nexus. That even in the random metaphors a theoretician chooses, such as this is like a stream, or this is like a fire, or you should memorize this, is revealed, is embedded a much more systematic view of the structure of the cosmos. And that even when Kubelka makes a claim that sounds like Vertov's intervallic theory, that the relationship is between the frames, that is, it is part of an impulse that is so totally different. It is part of a worldview that is as far apart as Augustine's and Marx. So, if there are any questions, I'll attempt to answer them. May I ask a question, and that concerns the comprehensibility of my English? Is it very hard? No? Do I go too fast? No, it's 10:30. I go too slow. What did he went faster, huh? Are there no questions? Everybody's dying to go home. Okay. You're free to go home.